So that looks like we've got most people on, so we will just make a start. So again, hi everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about the Smart Export Guarantee. My name is Joanna O'Loan and I am the Knowledge Manager here at the Energy Saving Trust. Over the past few years, we've been delivering webinars covering different aspects of renewables and the domestic energy sector more generally. This area of work is funded by the Scottish Government as part of their support for home renewables and energy efficiency, which is there to meet the climate change targets, help Scottish householders lower their energy bills, and also help towards building a lower carbon economy. Just before I go into the actual webinar and the presentation today, just a short bit of housekeeping. Just with the webinar, so you can hear us, but I can't hear you. That's kind of normal for webinars, so don't worry if there's kind of background noise behind you or anything. It's not going to infiltrate onto us today. On your screen now, you should see a webinar control panel. So here you can type any questions as they come up through the webinar. I've left some kind of 5-10 minutes at the end to kind of go through some Q&A. Hopefully I'll be able to answer your question today, but if not, we will kind of collate all the questions and hopefully get a response to you within the next few days. If you've got any issues or kind of technical issues as well, just type in there and we can hopefully sort that out for you. Finally, this webinar is scheduled to last approximately 40-45 minutes, and we'll be recording the session, so if you need to get away or you want to share the slides with anybody, you can always watch it back at a more suitable time. Cool, so let's get into it, the Smart Export Guarantee. So just a kind of brief look at our agenda today. We're going to look at what the Smart Export Guarantee is. I'm going to be calling it the SEG, and kind of that's the industry slang for it now, and how it operates. We'll be looking at the kind of eligibility criteria, so the things you'll need to satisfy in order to qualify for the SEG. And we'll also quickly look at some examples of the tariffs available and how you can go about applying for them if you're interested. We've also got a quick session on some frequently asked questions, and then, like I mentioned before, we should have 5-10 minutes left at the end for a quick question and answer session. Before we kind of go into the nuts and bolts of the SEG, though, just kind of wanted to give a brief background to kind of where we're at in Scotland with the domestic renewable sector. Solar PV, so solar photovoltaics, have had a boom since the introduction of the feed-in tariff, and I will quickly explain what they are, but they were introduced in 2010. The FIT scheme closed to new applicants, so kind of if you installed renewable generators either on or before the 31st of March 2019, you could qualify for FITs, but any kind of post-installation would no longer qualify for that scheme. So there's now a new support mechanism called the Smart Export Guarantee, or the SEG, and we'll go on today to talk about what that looks like and how it will support householders. So FITs, the brief history of, so it was introduced in 2010, but closed, as I mentioned, on the 31st of March last year. It was a government subsidised scheme, and it consisted of two payments, an export rate and a generation rate, and it paid the owner of the qualifying renewable technology. Originally it was for a kind of contract length of 25 years, and this was reduced to 20 years, and covered solar PV, wind turbines, micro CHP, anaerobic digestion, and small scale kind of hydro plants that you may have had. Particularly for solar PV, it really supported the uptake of that, and also helped in kind of played its part in reducing the cost. Obviously, there were some kind of global factors that influenced this too, but definitely when it was first introduced, we were looking at kind of the average 4 kilowatt peak system being about £10,000 to £15,000 for install. Now it's looking about £4,000 to £8,000, so definitely a dramatic decrease in the install costs of these systems. But now that the FIT has ended, this is a new support mechanism called the Smart Export Guarantee, and we'll kind of it works quite differently in terms of how it pays, but the principle is the same, in that you are paid for the electricity that you export to the national grid. So it's been in force since the start of this year, so the 1st of January 2020, and the eligible technologies up to a 5 megawatt capacity are solar PV, wind turbines, anaerobic digestion and micro hydro systems, and then also that qualify up to only a 50 kilowatt capacity are micro CHP that you might have. There are some rules for SEG licensees. You're probably more familiar with them as being kind of energy suppliers, but in this case they sorry about that. In this case, they're called SEG licensees. And you are a mandatory SEG licensee if you are an energy supplier with 150,000 or more customers. And if that's the case, you'll need to provide at least one SEG compliant tariff. And they can offer more, and they can also offer kind of non-SEG compliant tariffs as well, which we'll go into look in a bit more details later. And also non-obligated suppliers can also offer a SEG tariff as well. So maybe a supplier that doesn't have 150,000 customers or more, they can also offer a SEG, but that would be on a voluntary basis. Largely, as we'll kind of come to look at, is that the terms and conditions are set by the SEG licensee themselves. So there's only a couple of rules that really tie you to SEG compliancy. So we'll go on to look at what some of those terms and conditions might be, but that's why it's really, really crucial that you read through all those terms and conditions from your SEG licensee, because that will kind of determine if that SEG tariff is suitable for you. Some of these rules are that there has been no set rate of what the SEG licensee needs to pay you. So as long as it's above 0 kilowatts per hour, kilowatt hour, then that's fine. There's kind of a multitude of tariffs that are available or will be available, but they largely fall into two main categories. So that's a flat rate and a variable rate. And Ofgem will report on all these tariffs and their uptake each year so that we can see how well it's doing. So it's expected that the SEG market will be created in much the same way that kind of gas and electricity supply is created. So you'll be encouraged to swap around, you'll be encouraged to compare tariffs and compare the terms and conditions that come with each tariff, much like you would do maybe shopping for your gas or electricity supply at the moment. So as a tariff maybe becomes uncompetitive, switch to another with a more attractive offer, and that we should have quite a buoyant market available, and that should encourage competitivity between all the suppliers. So that's kind of the background of what the energy suppliers need to offer, but probably the meaty section of today is who's eligible, what tariffs are out there, and how do you apply for one if you're interested. So you'll need to have a qualifying technology. Kind of briefly mentioned those earlier, but I will look at kind of the qualifying criteria in a bit more detail shortly. That technology kind of been installed any time. So although I was mentioning the 31st of March 2019, that was the closure of FITs, but even if you installed before then, you can still apply for a SEG, and if you've installed after then, obviously, you might be much more interested in the SEG. You'll also need a smart export meter. It needs to be an export meter that is capable of reading exports on a half-hourly basis. Even if your tariff isn't paying you for every kind of half hour, your meter needs to be capable of that. If you don't have one of those, you'll need to speak to your energy supplier about the install for that. And if your meter cannot be read remotely so that you're not able to send your readings to them directly, again, it's something to discuss with your chosen SEG licensee about how they'll go about reading your meter and whether they can. If they can't, they aren't obliged to under kind of the SEG rules, so worth chatting to them about possible routes for that. So yeah, talking about the technologies that are eligible. So we can see here up to the 5 megawatt capacity, we have solar PV, wind turbines, anaerobic digestion and micro hydro systems. And then up to the 50 kilowatt capacity, we have micro combined heat and power systems. If you have an installation that would be higher than these capacities or total install capacities, they aren't covered by the SEG, although that would be quite a big scheme that you would have there. The installation and the installer must be suitably certified, and again I'll quickly mention what suitably certified means slightly later on. And as I mentioned already, you must have a smart export meter in order to qualify for the SEG. You make your application directly to the SEG licensee that you choose, but some of the information that they will definitely need kind of summarised in this table here. So for technologies with capacities less than 50 kilowatts, so solar PV, wind and micro CHP, you will need an installation certificate and also an installer certificate. For bigger systems of PV and wind, you will need an installation certificate, but not necessarily an installer certificate. And for anaerobic digestion and hydro, you will need the installation certificate, but not necessarily an installer certificate. Which certificates am I kind of talking about? So for that first group, it's probably most likely that you'll need to supply your microgeneration certificate scheme certificate, so MCS certificate. If you've applied for funding through Home Energy Scotland, The likelihood is that you probably already have an MCS certificate with the installers. That's a qualifying criteria to apply for those funding schemes. But if you don't have an MCS, it's not going to kind of rule you out, but you might need a certificate from another scheme as long as it's compliant with EN 45011 or EN ISO 17065. Kind of quite great names, catchy names. But one of these certificates should be okay. But again, you'll need to check with the SEG licensee about what they're willing to accept. Your SEG licensee, they will review the application. It's usually quite a straightforward pack, and you can usually apply online if that's available to you. And they'll determine whether you've kind of supplied enough evidence that your system is suitably certified. If you can't prove that your system is suitably certified, the SEG licensee isn't obliged to offer you a SEG tariff, although they can maybe find ways of accepting you, depending on their own kind of terms and conditions and policy around that. For other installations, so kind of larger installations, it is up to the SEG licensee to determine what they think is considered suitably certified. Again, it's likely to be a similar scheme where you're given a certificate based on the quality of the installation or the installer. But again, it would be prudent to speak to the SEG licensee directly just to find out what their requirements are for your system. So what tariffs are available? There is quite a mixture, some compliant with SEG and some not. We've taken just a small example available. Definitely go online, have a look at all kind of SEG licensees, so energy suppliers that are offering. You'll see here that there's kind of mostly flat rate, but one variable rate here. But again, there are many more, and I'll just kind of go through them. There's also the Solar Trade Association's website as well, who do rank them in terms of best price paid per kilowatt hour. But again, it's kind of key to check through the terms and conditions of each SEG licensee before committing, because as we'll see, not all of them are quite fully SEG compliant. So OVO's here, OVO SEG tariff, they are paying 4 pence per kilowatt hour flat rate for anybody who signs up to theirs. Octopus Energy, they have an outgoing tariff, it's called. The one that's SEG compliant is the one that's a 3 pence per kilowatt hour. However, you probably have maybe seen 5.6 pence advertised, and also a variable rate that changes every half hour depending on the current electricity market. That comes with kind of the caveat that you also need to be a consumption customer, so isn't technically SEG compliant, in that SEG compliancy means that you don't have to buy your energy from the same energy supplier. However, they do offer less money if you don't buy your energy from them at the same time, so it's worth keeping that in mind. Scottish Power, they have a 4 pence per kilowatt hour, but again, that's a variable rate, so it's 4 pence just now, but it might change as the energy market varies. They've kind of noted that they would make any change to the price known to you within a certain amount of time. Bulb export is a 5.38 pence per kilowatt hour, and that's a flat rate. Doesn't matter what time you're exporting your energy. And E.ON, they give a 3 pence per kilowatt hour flat rate, but again, they also offer higher ones if you also buy their solar panel system from them. So I think they offer 5.5 pence per kilowatt hour for exported electricity. There are also other ones out there, for instance, Social Energy. They've offered one, although they are doing this on a voluntary basis because they don't meet the criteria for a SEG mandatory tariff payer. So they're offering 5.6p per kilowatt hour, and that's again a variable tariff that will change depending on the electricity markets. But again, they will notify you if they plan any price changes to that. But again, it's on the basis that you're also buying your import energy or your consumption energy from them as well. So again, just have a look through and just make sure that that does suit you, and kind of do all your homework behind that before signing up to anything. But yeah, kind of a mix of different rates, and depending on the terms and conditions, if they apply to you too, you might be interested in taking on some of the higher rates that are available. So unlike the FITs, SEG isn't guaranteed for that 25 years or laterally 20-year contract lengths. The SEG licensee is free to kind of create their own terms and conditions, as we've discussed. So that includes the price per kilowatt hour, but also the length of contract. So some of them are maybe a year that you need to sign up for. They might come with exit fees. So just having a look through that and just make sure you are happy before kind of signing up to that. As ever, shop around, try and get as many quotes as you can. Just compare that everyone's tariff offer to your own consumption, how much you're likely to export. It is always financially best to kind of consume your energy versus exporting it. If you're maybe importing your energy, you're maybe looking around 14 pence per kilowatt hour-ish, which is obviously much more than what you would get for exporting it. So always keep an eye, of course, on what they're going to offer you, but it seems very unlikely that you'll ever get more for the energy you're exporting than what you're buying. So if you can use your energy, that's the best thing to do, and only the energy you can't consume, that's when the SEG can kind of come in handy and you can get paid for what you're exporting back. So you've kind of done your research, you've reviewed all the variable tariffs, you think you've picked one that suits you. So how do you apply for that? So you apply directly with the SEG, your chosen SEG licensee. As I mentioned, it doesn't need to be the same supplier as your energy supplier, but do check through the T&Cs just to make sure that what you're signing up for doesn't require that, and you aren't just getting the SEG compliant one if that's the case. It should be quite straightforward signing up, just the way you would for your electricity or your gas currently. The only exception to that are kind of two slightly different installations, one being anaerobic digestion installations. They also need to submit some information to Ofgem. Again, that's quite a straightforward form, and more information about that is on the Ofgem website. There'll also be some additional checks for battery storage. What those checks will be, again, are determined by the SEG licensee. Those checks are mostly to help them with forecasting how much energy they're likely to be buying from you, particularly if the contract is maybe 1 year or 2 years. They need to kind of think about how much energy you're likely to be selling to them, because they're agreeing to buy it off you. So just checking the battery storage. It might be that they're happy with just a schematic of the setup, so they know it's not being double counted, it's not kind of going into your battery storage and then being exported. But they might also require a site visit or more details around it, some certification or model numbers of your make of your battery. So again, check with them what they kind of need if this applies to you. And how will payments be made? Again, Ofgem haven't kind of stipulated any rule on the frequency of payments. It will be determined by the SEG licensee. If you are signing up to one of the SEG tariffs, that's kind of forcing you to also be supplied your energy from that company. Some of them are setting it up so that they'll pay you directly into your account and credit your account, so that might be quite convenient for some people. But if you're not getting your same energy, you're probably paid directly into your bank account. But again, depends on the SEG licensee in question. We've seen kind of variation as well between the different tariffs. So some of them are monthly, some of them are every 6 months, so some of them are every quarter, that kind of thing. So just have a look around at the frequency and make sure that you're happy with that. So that's just kind of gone through what the Smart Export Guarantee is, also how it operates, and how you apply if you're interested. We'll now kind of go through some frequently asked questions. So for those of you that are already claiming FITs, generators must not be in receipt of an export tariff. So householders, you guys, must not be in receipt of an export tariff under the feed-in tariff scheme if you're intending to claim SEG payments. So kind of as we kind of very briefly mentioned at the beginning, although I'm sure you understand if you're currently claiming FITs, is that your payment's made up of two elements, the FIT generation tariff and the FIT export tariff. The SEG licensee doesn't need to make any payments to a SEG under the SEG export if you are already receiving FIT export payments. So you would need to give up your FIT export in order to claim a SEG export if that's what you wanted to do. You can keep your FIT generation element though, so that won't be touched. So again, it depends on kind of the prices you're claiming there, but just kind of being aware that you can't kind of claim both. It will kind of constitute as fraud if you're caught doing both, so I would very much advise not doing that. Great, so if you received a grant loan to pay for your installation, are you still eligible? Yes. as long as you're still meeting all the kind of qualifying criteria that we mentioned earlier, you're still eligible for a SEG export tariff, even if you've received kind of government money towards installing your system. But just keeping in mind things like E.ON's higher tariff, that's only available to people that buy their solar from them. So again, just kind of keeping in mind some of these things. But yeah, providing you're still meeting the qualifying criteria, you're still eligible for a SEG export tariff. For those of you claiming the renewable heat incentive or RHI payments, yes, you can claim both. The likelihood is there'll be different technologies, the SEG covering electricity generation and the RHI covering heat generation. So they're unlikely to kind of overlap all that much, but you can be in receipt of both if you've got that kind of different technologies available. For those of you claiming regos, providing you still meet all the qualifying criteria, yes, you are still eligible for SEG export tariff. So that's when you are paid for every megawatt of electricity, renewable electricity that you're supplying to the grid. You can claim both, so that's not an issue there. If you have multiple exporting technologies, so this one kind of depends really on what those multiple exporting technologies are. So depending on the SEG licensee, they might approach the situation a little differently. If you're all qualifying exporting technologies, so a solar and a wind turbine, for example, you can probably be able to claim multiple SEG export tariffs. You'll just need to check with the SEG licensee about how they want to record that export, whether you need a separate export meter for each qualifying, or if they can combine them and do it through the whole same export. Depends on your setup, depends on your system, but the SEG licensee will be able to answer kind of questions around that. Where it becomes a bit more complicated is if you kind of have multiple sources, but they're not all qualifying. So two different systems, maybe one part is and one part isn't. Probably the likelihood is that you will need to be able to demonstrate the export section just for the bit that is qualifying. So you might need to separate somehow in your system. But again, it's dependent on the SEG licensee. They might be able to accept things. It'd be worth chatting through with them about how that would work in your case. Extensions to systems. So can you extend your SEG installation, so increase the capacity, and still continue to receive a SEG export tariff? You can install additional capacity to an eligible installation, that's no problem. Just keeping in mind that you'll need to remain below the kind of TIC or total installed capacity limits of 5 megawatts for most of them, or 50 kilowatts for micro CHP. SEG licensees are not obliged to make payments on kind of additional capacity over and above those limits, although, like we mentioned, a 5 megawatt system is a fairly large system. If you add capacity to an existing SEG installation that uses a different source as if you add capacity to an existing SEG installation that uses a different source of eligible technology, that's a separate installation, and so you could have separate installed capacities. So you could have kind of two systems there that both apply for SEG with their two export meters. If you're currently claiming FITs, though, again, this is a bit where you might end up having to give up your FITs export section of your payment. So under the FIT scheme, export payments are only deemed if it's not possible to measure your electricity generation with an export meter. So in order to apply for the SEG, though, obviously you need a smart export meter that's able to register what you're exporting. So now that you've got this, you now can't claim your FITs on deemed export anymore, so that 50% assumed is what you were exporting, no matter of how likely that was and how much that compared to reality. So you would now no longer be able to claim FITs export on a deemed basis, and you would need to go to a FITs pro rata export payment now based on kind of your real export. So at that point, you then might want to review kind of what it looks like with your FIT payment at that, or your SEG export that you might choose to apply for. Again, still being able to claim FITs generation tariff, but not the export element. You would have to give that up. So what happens if your SEG licensee no longer becomes a mandatory licensee? Perhaps they no longer have 150,000 customers or some other reason that would stop them becoming a mandatory SEG licensee. Any mandatory SEG licensee can't just stop offering a SEG export tariff, so they are bound to at least offer one tariff. Mandatory SEG licensees whose circumstances change, so they will continue offering that SEG licensee until the following 31st of March. So if they give up on the 1st of April, they still need to offer that SEG until the following 31st of March. And the same goes for voluntary licensees. So if somebody's offering a SEG tariff but isn't obligated to, they'll remain a SEG licensee until that following 31st of March. So you'll have at least that time while you're still on that tariff. Should your licensee though become insolvent, so in the case of kind of insolvency, you're responsible for finding another SEG licensee. So unlike supply, where Ofgem would make sure that you were being looked after and kind of the space between your company becoming insolvent, you wouldn't kind of run out of supply. This isn't the case in this case. So you should be given at least 6 weeks notice, but it is your responsibility for signing up to another smart export guarantee if that's what happens to you. Ofgem won't be responsible for kind of any break in between that time. So if you're not covered for a few weeks while you're searching for a new smart export guarantee, you can't claim that money back from anybody. So I think that's us kind of got to the end of the exact webinar, but hopefully we've got time for some kind of questions that have come up through the webinar. So one here is, what should I do if my export meter is broken? You should speak to your SEG licensee if that's the case. They will likely kind of replace the export meter. They don't have to pay you during that time. Kind of, again, it's part of the obligation on you as the householder that you have a working export meter in order to give them the readings. So they're not obligated to pay you in that time, but kind of as soon as you notice it's not working, either broken or making erroneous recordings, get in touch with your SEG licensee, who will probably come out and either replace it or fix it, depending on the issue. What do you do if you've got complaints already? This is crazy. If you've already got complaints regarding the smart export guarantee, again, speak to the SEG licensee in the first instance. I think it's after 8 weeks and you still haven't managed to kind of come to a resolution at that point, it can be directed to the Energy Ombudsman at that point. But again, if you've got issues, it's a SEG licensee. I think they have 8 weeks to try and come to a resolution for you before you get to that. Another question here. What do we think the impact of the introduction of the SEG is going to have on the market, particularly solar PV? Certainly we saw with FITs, it definitely aided the uptake. So I think incentives are kind of always a great tool. We hope the SEG encourages more kind of without this period between the closure of FITs and SEG coming into place. There's definitely been less installations, so hoping this will encourage more uptake again. But there are also other benefits to installing, and definitely get in touch with Home Energy Scotland to discuss those extra benefits if it's something you're thinking about. But the SEG is definitely a useful tool to help encourage people to make that move. What kind of tariffs do we think will be available in the future? Should I buy now or wait? Smart export guarantee is very new, so kind of as we've mentioned, it did just come into play on the 1st of January 2020, although there was some voluntary tariffs being offered in the early days before. I do think it's likely that we expect changes to all these tariffs. It is still new. Again, a lot of these contracts are maybe only for a year, so I'd definitely go ahead with it now if you find one that suits you and you've done all your homework and you've read through the policy and you agree with everything that they're saying there. But I would expect that there will be changes to the market kind of as it grows, as we see people shopping around, chopping and changing. Hopefully it encourages a healthy competition between all the energy providers, and that you're going around and finding SEGs that really suit you and what you're doing. Great question here. I've recently installed a battery. Should I store my energy or export it. You will always be better off financially consuming as much of the energy you generate yourself. We did kind of briefly talk about this earlier, that kind of any electricity you're importing is likely to be around 14 pence per kilowatt hour versus maybe 5 pence or whatever tariff you choose to select. So the difference there, if you can consume as much of your energy as possible, that's definitely the financial best decision. But having export there is useful. And if your battery fills up during the day, then export away, and it'd be great to have that little extra bit of income. Do we have other questions there? So what hardware is needed? A separate export meter from tenant supply meter? Yes. So it might be that your meter is capable of registering both your import and your exported electricity, but you will need a smart meter that is capable of recording your exports. This is likely to be a separate meter to your imported energy. SMETS 1 can be accepted for some of the types, but generally it'll be SMETS 2 meters so that they can kind of speak to the supplier directly and kind of let you know what your export is. But you will need a specific export, what's called an MPAN, or meter point administration number, and that's likely to be a separate meter to the rest of your electricity circuit. And if you don't have one of those, again, speak to the SEG licensee in the first instance, and they should be able to help you get that sorted or register an export MPAN if you don't have one. Why are there so few SEGs available when all the kind of energy suppliers over 150,000 are obligated to offer one? So the ones I presented are just an example. It's certainly not all the SEGs that are out there. Anyone, as we kind of mentioned, anyone that is one of the larger suppliers has to offer one. So go onto their website. They also have to advertise that they've got one. So if you go onto their website, it should be fairly obvious that where to go and where to find all the information about their tariff. And the Solar Trade Association, as I mentioned, has kind of got a ranking of all the prices, export tariff rates that are available. So they do all have one, and there's also some voluntary ones that are out there from smaller suppliers too. So the difference between installation and installer certificates. So the installation needs to be checked that the installation works and is of a certain quality, but also the installer, so the people coming in also need to go through that proper quality checks and quality assurance. So it's not necessary in the larger installs, but for the smaller installs, they need the confidence that both the installer is being checked or probably MCS accredited, but also that installation that they have installed, it's not just the installer is really good at it, but this person installing isn't that great. Both kind of sections need to be checked that they meet a certain quality standard. So likelihood is probably got an MCS accreditation behind those. So for people who are maybe on FITS already, we're getting a few questions from those guys wondering if they should continue on FITS export or move on to the SEG export. Sorry, it depends on what tariffs will be available to you. So in your FITS, you've maybe got this person signed up in 2013, so they probably have their contract for another kind of 20 years from 2013. Kind of add up how much you think you'll get from your export, because that export is known to you, so you'll know how much pence you're getting for your export, and then having a look at what's available. The key thing to note here, though, is that unless you have an export meter already, you're maybe getting deemed export, which means that they assumed that 50% of your total capacity was going to be exported to the grid, whether that was true or not. So it doesn't matter how much you're actually consuming. If you get an export meter in order to qualify for SEG, this is also going to affect your FITS export. So it's going to be now based on actual export. So if you were maybe using a lot more than the 50%, this is also going to have an impact on the income you can expect to earn. So just kind of keeping that in mind, that maybe installing a smart export meter, depending on how much you're using, might not be the financially best decision, depending on the tariff that you're being offered. But always worth looking, shopping around, doing your homework, trying to estimate how much you think you're actually using versus how much you could be potentially exporting, because definitely some of the seg prices are higher than what was offered in export. Time for a couple more questions, just having a look what's here. Some people saying they must have a SMETS 1 or SMETS 2 meter. Who installs this? The electricity supplier themselves is the best person to speak to. It won't be them that install it. They usually subcontract that work out to other people, but get in touch with them and they'll kind of make all the arrangements with your DNO and the subcontractor that'll come out and install that for you. But yeah, in order to qualify for Smart Export Guarantee, you need a Smart Export meter. It's kind of part of the game. So contact them and they'll arrange that installation. Cool, so I think we're actually getting a bit close to time. I can see a couple more questions just coming through, but what I will do is I will collate them and hopefully respond to them in a couple of days if I know the answer, and if not, I will find out the answer and get back to you when I can. I think we're going to have to stop there, but yeah, thank you all everybody for your attendance. Hopefully we'll address any kind of unanswered questions, and again, this webinar will be made available after, should you wish to review it, or you've had to leave early or join us late, or whatever. But again, thank you for your time. Hope to see you again soon.